the big pop culture drama over the weekend was about a new movie called The Great Wall, which I've been waiting to see a trailer for well over a year because it comes from one of my favorite cinematic subgenres, movies that sound like a premise you'd make up in order to make fun of stupid movie premises, as revealed by the trailer itself, which promises to teach audiences the real reason for the construction of the Great Wall of China and proceeds to reveal... Well now, with apologies to any history professors with heart conditions in my audience, this looks like a particularly rich, full-bodied vintage of stupid that I will more than happily imbibe when it comes out, while also appreciating the fascinating implications of its stature as an essentially Chinese-made film from Zhang Yimou. No, really, the same Zhang Yimou who did Raise the Red Lantern, Hero, and House of Flying Daggers is behind this, backed up by Hollywood money from Thomas Tull's Legendary Pictures, angling to serve as a model for how the nation that is fast becoming the most important market for selling big-budget movies can become a true powerhouse in making them. But for now, all anyone wants to talk about is Matt Damon, which is one of those things I know I shouldn't be surprised about, but was anyway. Like, obviously I recognize the inherent silliness that you always recognize in these movies where they write random white dudes into other people's countries' histories to supposedly make it more palatable to a Western audience. It's just, you know, I got my issues with you millennials, but I do dig how y'all actually get upset and try to do shit about stuff we used to just kind of shrug and sarcastically roll our eyes at. Good on you, for the most part. In any case, the problem with discussing so-called whitewashing or Orientalism when it comes to movies like this is that ironically said discussion tends to immediately be dominated on all sides by voices coming exclusively from either a white perspective or a Western one, meaning that both the voices of the people and the culture actually being directly affected here are shut out of the conversation before it starts because they're not heard in the first place or because they want to make the narrative more complicated than the 21st century cross-cultural discussion tends to want it to be. Case in point, when it comes to movies like The Great Wall, the cycle tends to be Asian American voices say, hey, that's not cool, well-meaning white liberal allies jump in to enthusiastically agree, yes, that is indeed not cool. The usual gang of assholes then pipes up to loudly declare, it's fine, why you gotta SJW about everything? And then someone actually from the non-American, non-Western culture in question opines, you know, actually, this is part of a much more nuanced and complex set of issues that doesn't boil down to this relatively limited argument. At which point the assholes then declare, see, somehow that means we were right, and then the whole thing degenerates further into unrelated bullshit wherein nothing gets resolved. And frankly, being myself slightly whiter than a freshly bleached polar bear, it's not my place to unpack all that shit. But what I do know about is the movie business. So, it is in fact mostly true that the prism through which diversity and movie casting are discussed in the United States is not exactly an ideal analogous paradigm for discussing matters of race and casting elsewhere in the world, largely because they have different histories and different concerns. To use a recent example, Scarlett Johansson playing a Japanese woman in Ghost in the Shell was received correctly, in my opinion, as bullshit in the United States, in part because, aside from being just dumb, it was seen by Asian American audiences as what should have been a prime opportunity for their underrepresented community to have a blockbuster hero of their own being taken away. But in Japan, the news was received with either ambivalence or even support, at least in terms of, hey, a famous and beloved Japanese property will be headlined by one of our biggest international superstars on the planet, which is evidently a less pressing concern, at least for some anime fans in Japan, than their culture being co-opted and strip-mined by white Westerners or Japanese Americans feeling culturally marginalized. Which argument is correct? I don't really think it's my fucking place to say, though I will opine that when it comes to cross-racial sensitivity, Japan is not really the first country I look to as an authority, but that's another show. Either way, a similar dichotomy was almost certainly at play in the making of The Great Wall. Make no mistake, if the film's financiers thought they could draw the same box office returns with only its much less expensive Chinese cast, including Andy Lau, Lu Han, Jing Tang, etc., they would have preferred to, but the goal was to make a Chinese film whose release had the feel of a Hollywood blockbuster, and to a lot of the world, a crucial signifier of that feel is that a big giant head on the poster is either a famous white guy or The Rock, or, you know, Will Smith 10 years ago, or Eddie Murphy 10 years before that, but usually a big white guy. Now, some folks like to look at this phenomenon as evidence of so-called meritocracy, an easy candidate for the most abused English language world in present-day popular culture, outside perhaps ethics, i.e. Hollywood's surplus of interchangeable white guys seem to still be very much in demand worldwide, so why are we even having this conversation? But what that argument fails to take into account is how we got here in the first place, and that matters. See, yes, it's true that the Hollywood film industry understands that diverse casting is the way of the future domestically. They've seen the data that shows Latino audiences attend more movies than any other group. They know firsthand that films aimed specifically at the black community frequently racks up big returns. They've watched the super diverse Fast and Furious franchise become one of their biggest moneymakers, and you'd better believe they've followed those demographic charts indicating that the United States will have a majority-minority population within most of our lifetimes. And while some corners of the industry have been slower to respond to that than others, let's be very clear. There's a reason that, for example, Marvel, who'd still like to be making hit movies a decade from now, is aggressively pushing for comic fans to start getting used to the idea of a biracial Spider-Man, or a black female Iron Man, or a Pakistani Miss Marvel, or an Asian Hulk. However, Hollywood has only really been so, as the kids say today, woke about this stuff for about the last decade and a half, whereas before that, Hollywood spent over a century not only codifying white omnipresence as the default setting of their productions, especially their biggest, flashiest, most expensive productions, but also exporting that idea of white default omnipresence to the rest of the world. And the result of that, decades later, is that generations of international movie fans, even in territories like China, Japan, India, Iran, Nigeria, etc., that do have their own thriving, vibrant domestic film industries, have had to accept a kind of dodgy cultural compromise when it comes to the uneasy balance of scope, scale, and representation. One where if you wanted to see the biggest, flashiest, most cutting-edge Hollywood blockbusters, it meant seeing mostly American settings and mostly white faces, while settling for cheaper special effects and lower production value overall was something you more or less settled for from domestic productions as the cost of seeing a movie that represented your culture and starred your movie stars. And 100 years plus of that scenario is how you wind up in a situation where even as American film is taking aggressive baby steps into a more globalist idea of what its heroes should look like, national cinemas like that of China are more eager than ever to rent out Hollywood's gently used white guys as a way of quote-unquote legitimizing their big movies. Because it's not just Matt Damon in The Great Wall, folks, it's also Christian Bale inexplicably leading Flowers of War, or Jackie Chan's newest movie co-starring fucking Johnny Knoxville. Over in Bollywood, Doom 3 was shot and set mainly in Chicago, pretty much because it would help the movie look like The Dark Knight, and they wanted the movie to look like The Dark Knight. Is this something that eventually works itself out as globalization marches on and versions of the same post-national demographic ship that shaped the US film landscape take hold elsewhere? Logically, sure, that only makes sense, but like we established earlier, it took over a century of film history to get here, so it'll suck for the domestic stars and filmmakers of, in this case, the Chinese film industry, to have to wait even half that long for things to turn around. So yeah, it's easy to look at The Great Wall and go, well, Matt Damon wasn't in ancient China, but they also didn't build the Great Wall to fight monsters, so what's the big deal? And it's not like Matt Damon isn't a likable, dues-paying star in his own right, nothing against him, but there's a kind of weird, gross irony to the idea that what's looking like the start of the Chinese film industry's moment as a power center of international filmmaking doesn't also get to be fully a moment for Chinese film industry talent. I mean, does that seem right to you? Because it sure as fuck doesn't seem right to me.